All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jen Jones, Chief Strategy and Experience Officer here at RGP, and I'm so excited to moderate today's conversation, the human value gap in M&A, why culture and talent drive deal value. M&A deals are built on valuation models, diligence, and projected synergies, but sustainable value often depends on something harder to measure, people. Our research study in 2026, the Human Value Gap in M&A, surveyed 120 CFOs and interviewed 15 CHROs from some of the world's largest companies. The findings reveal a clear gap between what organizations know matter, like culture, leadership, and talent, but what they actually protect during integration. So today we're going to explore why that gap persists and what leaders can do to close it. I'm joined by an exceptional group of panelists, as well as my co-moderator, Wendy Amstutz. And then our panelists, they have really come from M&A from every angle. We have CFOs, CHROs, strategists, advisors, operators, but they've all really, experienced this exact thing as they've gone through complex transactions. So today I'm joined by Roxana Flores, Senior Director of People Advisory Partners at the Trade Desk, Christina Smith, Chief Transformation Officer at CDS Consulting, John Linker, former CFO of Husky Technologies, Gerald Adolph, former Senior Partner and M&A Leader at Booz Allen Hamilton, and Danny Boyer. He's our actually very own M&A practice leader here at RGP. So before we begin, a quick reminder, today's session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. To earn your CPE credit, you need to attend the full webinar and then answer at least 3 of the live polling questions. We also want to have questions. So and we're going to try to leave some time at the end to go through some of those questions. So if you have any thoughts, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end. So let's dive in. So first, we're going to start talking about really evaluating culture during due diligence. This phase is where organizations are often most financially disciplined, but where many culture issues get overlooked. Our research actually suggests that culture is rarely ignored because leaders didn't think it mattered. It was actually ignored because the deal system itself rewards speed, certainty, and closing momentum. In this section of discussion, I want to explore where culture warning signs get missed, minimized, or intentionally worked around before the deal is signed. So Roxana, I'm going to start with you. Roxana, you actually witnessed one of the most studied merger failures in corporate history. And looking back, what were the cultural realities that were visible before the deal closed that the system either minimized or ignored? And what should organizations really learn from today?
Yeah, thank you. One of the biggest lessons I think I learned is that, and I think we know this, but culture doesn't show up on a balance sheet, right? But it absolutely shows up in the outcome. And in the acquisition that you are referring to, the cultural differences were obvious long before the deal closed. The acquiring company had a very traditional leadership style and a way of operating. The company being acquired was more diverse, more collaborative, and had built much of its success around the people leading it. And none of that was hidden. It was visible to anyone who took the time to look. The assumption, however, was that the culture would simply adapt after the transaction closed, and it didn't. Many of the cultural stewards were removed almost immediately. The message employees received was super clear. The culture, relationships, and ways of working that helped make that company successful weren't viewed as assets worth preserving.
Mm.
And I think that is probably where organizations often get it wrong. They believe that they're acquiring a business, a product, or a capability, but in reality, they're also acquiring a culture, and the two are not inseparable. And as a result, I've seen firsthand that integration is not a systems exercise, it's a human one. When people feel respected, informed, and included, they lean in. When they feel dismissed or uncertain, you see disengagement, resistance, and turnover. And sometimes people leave, sometimes they stay, which can be even more dangerous because they stop bringing their best ideas, energy, and effort to the work. I think the lesson for leaders today is that cultural due diligence deserves the same rigor as financial due diligence. Who are the culture carriers? Which leaders do people trust and follow? What behaviors actually drive success? And perhaps most importantly, don't confuse integration with assimilation. The goal isn't for one culture to win and the other to lose. It's to preserve the best of both organizations and create something stronger together. And I think when companies get that right, people accelerate value creation. And when they get it wrong, culture becomes the hidden reason the deal never delivers what was promised.
Oh, that's really interesting, Roxana.
Gerald, I wanted to know, in your experience, having witnessed so many deals over so many years, has anything changed in cultural due diligence? Have we gotten better at it, or are we just having the same conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I think we can say that people are discussing it and raising it, and it comes up more frequently, and especially because there are so many transactions these days for growth and strategy reasons that are unlike combinations, big and small, upstream, downstream, et cetera. And when you get one of those, sort of the cultural issues pop to the top. But maybe in overlap combinations, people are assuming a little more as opposed to doing the systemic work that Roxanne was just alluding to. I would ask the test for people to think about. First of all, the acid test: would you walk away from a deal for culture reasons? Would you alter the deal terms? Does it show up in your from diligence in how you're going to think about integration planning issues? When it does show up, where is it on in your organization on a scale from rigorous analysis to kind of dinner conversation? And a systemic assessment is what you really need, a systemic assessment of beliefs, values, behaviors, communication styles, decision-making processes, management processes, office environment. That free coffee may not just be free coffee, that could be a cultural marker.
Mhm.
As Roxanne just alluded to, who are the culture carriers? Where's the culture core in the organization? The last thing I would ask is, do you have a solid foundation to start from? Can you actually answer those questions about your own company?
Mhm. That's all great, Gerald. And John, that actually, Gerald perfectly teed up our next question. So when cultural concerns actually do surface during due diligence, what types of these concerns are genuinely considered deal shaping risks and what gets pushed to integration and maybe shouldn't?
Sure. Yeah, from my experience, I'd put culture topics that are identified in diligence into two broad buckets. And I'm sure there's more, but this is kind of my experience. I mean, typically in a target that you're evaluating, you'll see things about the culture you want to maintain or improve or not break, or you'll see things that might need to be mitigated in that culture. So, on the first one, on the maintain, I've seen this where the M&A target, maybe they got some sort of secret sauce in their culture. They're a startup, a disruptor feel, and the acquirer is maybe a larger corporation that's got more red tape, and they know they don't move as quickly. Um, so the acquirer knows, boy, we don't want to break that startup feel because that's the secret sauce of the business. We got to plan that into integration in terms of how we maybe keep them apart. Same thing could be around financial incentives. Entrepreneurial driven companies, most people are owners, and how is that going to work if a large company acquires them? Can you continue to offer the same financial incentives? And so finding those things that make the acquisition target tick, and then planning into how you structure the deal, who's leading the company, and then how that's going to operate post closing and integration. On the flip side, I've run across businesses and acquisitions where there's absolutely things we know about the culture that we're going to have to mitigate. So maybe a small founder-owned business. The founder is used to running his lifestyle expenses through the company, through the P&L, and nobody wants to stand up to the founder because they're the founder, but they're being bought by a large public company that has to do SOX certifications or internal controls. And so in that environment, what like day one, you're going to have to mitigate that cultural element and maybe drop in your own controller. You're going to have that plan so that day one, you've got control of the expenses of the company, and you can mitigate maybe what historically worked, but what's not going to work, go forward under the new umbrella. So yeah, I think the planning for the cultural elements, it falls into how you structure the deal as well as what happens day one integration.
Makes total sense.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm Christina, I want to direct this at you because I know you've been a CFO and now are Chief Transformation Officer. So you've seen sort of a few sides of things. What would it take for a CFO or board to actually walk away from a deal, do you think?
Well, when it comes to the CFO and the board, they're not going to walk away just because there are risks that are employee related risks. It's really when that risk, even after doing all of the diligence that they just talked about, it's when it turns from a manageable integration issue into something that is a deal breaker for value creation. For instance, it could be customer retention, it could be post close execution, it could be operating continuity. When those things get to a level of risk, that it causes the board to start asking, is this a pricing issue? Is this a structural issue on how we structure the deal? Or is it truly a no-go issue?
Interesting.
So Danny, given the fact that run our M&A practice here and get to work with so many different organizations within this space, I would ask you, if leaders know culture and integration determine long-term value, why are most deal incentives still tied to getting the transaction done rather than really proving sustained value? And are we structurally rewarding the wrong behaviors? Oh, Danny, you're on mute.
I apologize.
Okay.
Well, sure. Thanks, Jed. While I wouldn't say we're rewarding the wrong behaviors, I would say we're not rewarding all the right ones, right? It's a design feature of the M&A process. It's the way the system has worked forever, right? So if we think about the way M&A goes, investment banks are collecting success fees at closing. Diligence is often sort of a financially sort of spreadsheet focused sprint, right? Executives receive bonuses tied to announcement or close. Boards celebrate the deal announcement as a win. And nowhere in that structure is anyone accountable for cultural integration success at year 3, 4, 5, and beyond, right? So, as you know, Jen, the research sort of found that 50% of CFOs expect ROI within 24 to 36 months. Our CHRO interviews told a bit of a different story, where true cultural integration takes 5 to 7 years. So that mismatch is a structural incentive problem, right? The deal team is long gone, bonuses are paid, scorecards are clean, and that's when sort of these cultural fractures start becoming visible. So what would actually change, in my opinion, change behavior is redesigning accountability. So imagine a world where, again, we're not rewarding wrong behaviors because the finances do matter, but there are other things to reward as well. So imagine a world where exec compensation is tied to post-close human capital metrics, right? Integration team earnouts are linked to 2, 3, 4 year retention and engagement outcomes. Board governance frameworks are treating cultural integration milestones the same way they treat financial synergy targets, right? And so I think what I tend to see is that the organizations that are leaning that direction are identifying and planning for and effectively achieving sustaining value much better than those that are again sort of modeling from spreadsheets and sort of getting to day one and letting everything go.
Okay. Well, we're going to do our first survey. So if Jackie, if you want to put that up for the team. All right. So which of the following is most commonly responsible for cultural risks being overlooked during the M&A due diligence? We'd love to hear your thoughts. All right. I think we can close that out and move to the next section. All right. So post-close danger zone is kind of what we're going to move into now. So what happens after the deal closes? Because this is really where the value often becomes, really begins to quietly erode. And when we saw repeatedly in the research is that financial integration and organizational integration are not the same thing. And companies could look financially successful long before they are truly integrated organizationally. The earliest warning signs tend to be people systems, so talent loss, trust erosion, slowing collaboration, weakening alignment. I mean, even as small as somebody continuing to wear the old brand logo, to a town hall, those types of things. I want to explore what those warning signs actually look like, who owns them, and why companies often recognize the problem too late. So I'm going to direct this to everyone on the panel. Can each of you describe one moment where you realize a deal was quietly beginning to fail? Roxana, I might start with you.
For me, it was people that had a voice, that were always sort of pushing forward new ideas, issues went silent. I think that was a real alarm bell for me. People just stopped talking.
Mm. John, how about you?
Hmm. I mean, if you don't mind, I'll go to an example um, where it really impacted senior leadership, I would say. So in this case, the seller thought they were doing the right thing. They put sort of longer term incentives in place to make sure the senior leadership team would be there through the transaction. The buyer did the same thing. They did what they thought was right, put the right financial incentives in place to retain the leadership team. Um, but the buyer, in some cases didn't really listen. They didn't build trust, they didn't really build alignment, and they failed to kind of win the hearts and minds of some of the senior leaders on the team. And at that point, you see people start to get disengaged. And when they're not engaged, then there's turnover, and that can be very costly for everyone. And so I think it's that moment when everything seems like it's there on paper, but if you don't actually sort of win the trust and invest in the culture side of things, that's probably where I can see things running off the rails.
Yeah. And I think the financial aspect is typically how these things are approached to retain talent. But in the research study that was actually, came out as probably the lower level things that actually worked is retention bonuses, incentives, things like that. It was actually the other types of things like retaining culture, being slower to integrate, potentially leaving innovation pods. Those things tend to have more impact on the team, like long term. Christina, did you want to go?
Sure. So part of it is like Roxana said, when it comes to the people on the team, I've seen it where people agree in the meetings, but the chatter in the halls is anything but agreement. And particularly in instances where you see leaders doing that. And then leaders walking early, even months before the deal actually closes. It really sends a signal to the rest of the people in the organization that it's not going to be a situation where people are working together. It's going to be an us versus them. And I think it's really unfortunate when things like that happen because people are really looking to their leaders in that time of uncertainty.
Makes sense. Gerald, what are your thoughts?
So I had an example, the beginnings of quiet failure. Full service company wants to add an advisory arm, kind of as an upfront lead into the rest of their services. They're all in a room together with the senior leadership, and they're doing various briefings. And the full service firm is talking about risk and risk management. And they said, we don't allow people to do forecasts and predictions and things like that, in a lot of our work. And the advisors are sitting there thinking, do you actually know what you just bought? You want us to go in front of a client and say, boy, we've got this really brilliant strategy, but we can't tell you how much it's worth or how to,
Yeah.
you could see people begin to start checking out.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Danny, any thoughts from you? You've witnessed a lot of these through the angle of consulting. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of small shifts that often signal problems early, right? It's not always a sort of large dramatic event. So if I think about even as Christina mentioned, if you think about retention, you've lost key leaders. More importantly, if you've lost leaders that you weren't planning around, right? When you do a deal, sometimes you expect a certain level of attrition, certain roles, certain folks are going to walk at certain points, right? When you've lost or have regretted attrition, when you've got someone that you really needed that walks away, when you hear practitioners using language like referring to themselves as legacy company A, as opposed to part of the new company, right? They're not really embracing the culture. When you see decision making stall or the velocity slow because cross-functional teams can't align, so you're not seeing integrated collaboration across the cultures as you're working through the integration or transformation that's happening. Any number of these kind of small indicators can quickly snowball and really drive, maybe not all the way to failure, but to a number of challenges that sort of defer or eliminate value in a deal.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting, Danny. I'm going to direct this at Roxana. Just what is the top reasons top talent leaves? And do you think management is, honest with themselves about that?
Yeah. Top talent rarely leave because of a single event. They leave because something important to them changed. And at some point, they stop believing that the future is better than the present. After an acquisition, leaders often assume people leave for money. Sometimes that's true, but in my experience and to what we alluded to earlier, compensation is usually the final push, not the root cause. The real reasons are often much more human. People lose trust in leadership. They become uncertain about their future role or career path. The culture they join starts to feel different. Decision making, which was brought up earlier, seems further away from them. Leaders they respected leave, or they begin to question whether the new organization truly values what made them successful in the first place. And then there's fatigue. Acquisitions create an enormous amount of ambiguity, and people can handle change, but what wears them down is months of uncertainty, waiting, and feeling like they have no control over what comes next. I've seen organizations focus heavily on retention bonuses, equity grants, and compensation adjustments while missing the bigger issue entirely. The employee no longer sees a future for themselves there. They're not identifying with the new organization. And you can certainly pay people to stay for a certain amount of time, but it's much harder to win their hearts and minds, to make them believe again. And I think one of the biggest mistakes leaders make is relying too heavily on, exit interviews, or, by the time someone resigns, that decision is often months in the making. No one just makes a decision overnight. And the more valuable conversations are sort of in what's going to keep them engaged and get them to stay. I think that's where you learn what keeps someone with you, what excites them about their work, what frustrations are building beneath the surface, what's happening with the silence, what might ultimately cause them to leave. And as for whether executives are honest with themselves about why people leave, I think sometimes, but not always. It's much easier to say they left for more money than it is to ask the harder questions about leadership, communication, culture, or design, or the employee experience. Money is just a clean answer. And trust, culture, and leadership are much more complicated. The best leaders that I've worked with really are courageous about asking the tough questions, right? Looking beyond the resignation code and asking, what role did I play or did we play in this decision? They understand that attrition is data, but it's also feedback. People can tolerate tremendous amount of change. What they struggle with again is uncertainty, silence, and the feeling that decisions are being made about them rather than with them.
Dana, I think you hit the nail on the head. You actually reminded me of this thought that always comes in my head when we talk about this particular topic, and is every merger really asks the same question. It asks, can people believe in a future they didn't choose? And I think that's where we got to get people. And oftentimes we do it the wrong way by, to your point, throwing money or throwing titles or things like that, versus really saying, why would they choose to work here? And why would they choose to be a part of this team? And what are those things that we can really make meaningful? Christina, that brings me to you. How much of post-merger integration failure is rooted in identity disruption and power dynamics rather than operational complexity? And why do you believe leaders are so often underestimate those risks?
Well, I think a lot of the failures, I think, are rooted in just that, in that loss of identity, and also the power dynamics in a complex environment. The operational work of the integration, the systems, the processes, the org charts, those are all hard, but they're solvable. The harder part is really with the people. When people no longer recognize who they are within this new organization, and then you combine that with some of the power shifts and the power dynamics that can cause things like turf wars and defensiveness, disengagement, that lack of collaboration between teams. From a transformation perspective, I think the real work is helping people move from who we were to who we're becoming. Because if you skip that part, then you might end up with an org chart that looks really good on paper, but doesn't function well in practice. As far as underestimating the risk, I'm not so sure that it's underestimating the risk. It's simply that quantifying things like financials and processes, timelines, things of that nature, they're more objectively quantifiable, which means they make the scorecard. The things around employee identity, emotions, they're a little bit less quantifiable. And so with the subjectivity in those, people tend to not focus on them as much.
Well, thank you, Christina. And that brings me to Gerald. I'm just wondering, you know, most boards will say it's a great success at 24 months, but are companies mistaking financial integration for organizational integration? And what might year three look like in a company that is quietly failing at the people integration? And then at that point, who should be in charge of protecting enterprise value, do you think?
Well, yeah, you're right. The artifacts like 100 days, 24 months, those are in fact artifacts. So 24 months around financial is really a symbol of long enough to make some changes, but not so long that the financials get mucked up in a lot of other market and noise. Uh, Culture failures, I think, as Daniel alluded to, show up actually right away. One does not have to wait 3 years. I had a circumstance in the initial integration kickoff meeting where I did a big presentation on how the integration teams are going to operate. And the acquired team walked out of the meeting and told the acquirer, yeah, we're not going to do that. Um, and surprise, surprise, 3 years later, that company was still stuck in parallel. 7 or 8 years later, they wound up divesting the company because it never got integrated. So Christina and Daniel talked about the small flags, the legacy language, the legacy symbols, the legacy processes that survive. I would add the hero and mythology stories. If 3 years out, you know, if the mythology of who's a hero hasn't shifted to what you want it to be, that's another small sign. There are the obvious signs, obviously, of attrition and talent attrition, but more often than not, I think in the long term, the culture problem is going to show up in growth and in revenue more so. People will ram the cost savings through, but it's going to show up largely in those other things where you really need a softer set of integration.
Mm,
Daryl,
interesting.
where in that example that you gave, where, after 3 years they divested, would there have been anything you would have done differently now, looking back on it, like that you think could have potentially protected that and moved that in a different direction?
I mean, I know what I would have done differently. I don't know what the company would have done differently because, cute story out of school. 12 years later, I had this conversation with their CFO as they did another acquisition, and they got stuck in parallel on that one also and wound up dividing. So you try to help, you can help. But I mean, you asked the question, who should be in charge of
Mm-hmm.
value
Yeah.
creation? The trite answer is everybody. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this is not like, the kids in the backyard in the pool where you say if everybody's watching, no one's watching. In this case, it really is. Right? We learn that from safety and quality and diversity and continuous improvement that, if you don't have top level champions, bottoms up focus, the middle engaged, I mean, the experts are just there to provide some design and some support, but it's really got to be owned by everybody.
Mm.
Sense. All right, John, kind of moving to you. Have you seen a case where a buyer and a seller both felt very confident that they had structured the right financial incentives to retain senior leadership, but only, really have it to fall short?
Yeah, I mean, it alludes to kind of the example I was talking about a few minutes ago. So, I mean, I think what I, you know, but a lot of parties make the assumption, and it sounds like it's come up several times already on this call, that if you have the right financial incentives are there, then people will stay, and you can buy time for a short amount of time. But ultimately, I think if the acquirer comes in and sort of says we got one way that we're going to operate this new business, and they're not willing to listen to sort of what makes the target tick, what's the special sauce about their culture, and they're sort of trying to jam through that their own style onto an existing culture. That's where the financial incentives just don't matter, because people, I mean, life's too short. People won't put up with it. And then you think about, what does that cost the acquirer? Okay, now you've lost a few months with turnover, trying to replace people, you're behind on your business case. And it's like, in the short term, seems like a great decision, but the longer term costs of making, not listening, I think is probably what gets undervalued in those situations.
Makes total sense, which kind of brings me to my next section, which we're going to talk about is the remedy. But before we do that, let's do one more polling survey. So if you want to put that up there, Nicole and Jackie. All right, so this one is, which of the following is often one of the earliest indicators that post-merger integration challenges are emerging? Delayed financial reporting, regulatory compliance findings, talent attrition, declining trust, and weakening collaboration, or missed quarterly earnings targets. So we'll give you guys a minute to answer that. All right, I think we can close that poll and move into the remedy. So how do we remedy this? If long-term deal value depends on culture, leadership, continuity, talent retention, and innovation capability, then what needs to fundamentally change in how companies approach integration? And so, Jared, I'm going to start with you on this one. If you were advising a CFO 6 months away from closing a significant acquisition, what are the 2 or 3 things you would tell them to do differently than they are probably planning to do in specifics to kind of this human value gap?
I'd advise them that to recognize right off the bat that a culture integration in an M&A context is radically different from the culture transformation journeys they may have gone on in their company previously. When you do it within a company, it's usually one theme. It's a bit of a journey. You're migrating from and to. You're focusing on a couple important behaviors. In an M&A context, there are multiple culture projects going on simultaneously because everything's been, thrown up in the air. It's not a journey. You have some very specific time constraints that you have to hit. Otherwise, you're not going to get your value and get your synergy. The destination may not be clear. You start a single company culture journey, say, I want to go from to. In a merger, as I think John alluded to earlier, you're sort of discovering a bit of what the two is as you're trying to do so it's fundamentally different. Point number one. Therefore, you need some very fundamentally different processes. Those outside benchmarking and top-down vision things are okay, but they're insufficient. There are at least 5 or 6 other kinds of processes and approaches to be added on top of that. I would say that you got to make sure that the culture is embedded in every integration team. Don't give it to HR. Don't give it to a separate culture team. It's got to be embedded in every team. And I'd also say that people will tend to use culture, change management, and communications interchangeably. They actually are 3 different things. Culture is dependent on change management and comms, particularly in an M&A environment. Change and comms have a lot of other things to do. So it really does merit its own focus as they merit their own focus.
Jared, speaking specifically about culture, like I love what you said as far as like everybody owns it. And I think that's even outside of M&A, when you think about employee experience and why, companies truly succeed and why, people have a lot of attrition in general, it's typically embedding that culture everywhere in the organization. And so what I'd ask you in an M&A, when you're combining 2 different companies that have probably pretty distinct cultures, especially like maybe you've made a technology acquisition and it's, has this developer-led, innovation-led kind of culture coming into an organization that might be run very differently. My question is to you, how do you make decisions on culture? And how does one or does one not win out? And how do you really embed that in kind of every aspect?
Yeah. So first of all, I would just point out that in an M&A context, when we talk about culture, it's them, not it. I mean, myriad of microcultures throughout the organization that you need to tackle. So it isn't one thing, even though there may be some top-down overarching themes. I go back to what I call strategic intent, which is why did I do this in the first place, and how good is your understanding of that? And can you translate the answer to that question into specific businesses and functions to get to what John was alluding to earlier? In some cases, I'm going to combine to get something better. In some cases, I want to migrate one way or the other way. In some cases, I actually do intentionally want to leave them separate. And now I have to figure out how I'm going to bridge and get value. But that answer actually gets answered at a micro level, not a macro level in an M&A context.
That's great. Thanks, Gerald.
Thank
You want
you.
to go to the next question?
Yeah, John, since we don't have a widely accepted kind of board-ready way to measure cultural health, is there something that you think can be a bellwether of the cultural health of integration? And are there interventions at the board level that could or should be made?
I don't think there's a blueprint for this yet. I mean, I think, in my experience, the most disciplined acquirers they're usually very rigorous and honest with themselves about how is the acquisition performing. They're doing look backs at the end of every quarter to say, are we on track with the business case or with the ROI? That's transparent with the board. Like those are the most disciplined acquirers. But in reality, I mean, financial results on a quarterly basis, those are lagging indicators. And so if we're talking about sort of these cultural elements, I think we need to be thinking about more leading indicators that might tell you how the integration or the M&A is going. So that might be, something like doing, engagement surveys, pulse surveys more frequently with the acquired company. Might be like board looking, diving into turnover stats and on time to fill. Like if, is it harder to fill positions at the acquired company because people don't go to work there? So trying to find those metrics, that would be leading to tell you how the financial performance, I think, is where I would encourage companies to look. And it's probably different depending on the business model. And then the other intervention I would suggest that the board could do or should do, and I'd say, I mean, I've seen this at both public companies with boards that are bold as well as in private equity circumstances. But if something's not working, like with the leadership, or make the change early. Don't let it fester because you gotta have to have the intellectual honesty to say we were wrong, we got it wrong, and we're going to make a change. And for the board to be willing to intervene early into an integration and make that change, it takes some courage, but usually that can sort of, in my experience, mitigate some of the downstream financial impact.
That's great, John. And I love the courage to make a change for sure. Roxana, this question goes to you. So how do leaders distinguish between integration that creates scale and integrations that unintentionally destroy the innovation capability, autonomy, or creative culture they were trying to acquire in the first place? So are there clear parts of a company that shouldn't be integrated, or maybe integrate at a different pace or be treated differently?
Yeah, I think no two cases are the same, but this is a really important question because the very things that make a company attractive to acquire are often the first things that get unintentionally dismantled during an integration.
Yeah, so true.
Leaders understandably focus on scale, efficiency, governance, and synergy targets. But the question that they should constantly ask is, are we integrating something that creates value, or are we integrating something that creates compliance? And those are not always the same thing. I think Gerald said this earlier, the best integrations start by identifying what the acquiring company is actually buying. If you're buying manufacturing capacity, then standardization may be the goal. If you're buying innovation, talent, intellectual property, customer intimacy, speed, or a unique culture, then over integration can destroy the asset you just paid premium to acquire. I've seen leaders immediately impose new reporting structures, decision rights, approval processes, tech platforms, and cultural norms because they feel it's efficient. And 6 months later, they're wondering why innovation slowed or key talent left, and that sort of entrepreneurial energy disappeared. And the answer is usually pretty simple. They integrated the very thing they were trying to buy. In my view, there are absolute areas that should often remain protected, even if for a little while, just to figure out the rigor, the cadence, the rhythm of those teams. Product development and innovation teams, research and development functions, entrepreneurial operating models, unique customer-facing practices that drive that loyalty that make a business successful, high-performing leadership teams, culture carriers, decision-making processes that enable the speed and agility. On the other hand, there are areas where I think integrations can create immediate value, and that is like, your finance teams, your legal teams, your compliance teams, those kinds of shared functions. I think that they could benefit from consistency and scale. The mistake is assuming that every function should be moved at the same speed. I often encourage leaders to think about integration layers. Layer one is infrastructure, payroll, benefits, compliance, security, and governance. And layer two is operating model alignment. And layer three is cultural leadership and ways of working. Most organizations try to do all three simultaneously. The more successful ones move more deliberately and ask what must be integrated now and what should earn the right to be integrated later. One of the smartest approaches I've ever seen involved granting the acquiring company a period of operational autonomy post-close with guardrails. The acquiring company essentially said, show us what makes you successful before we change it. And that created trust, preserved innovation, and gave both of the organizations time to understand what was truly driving the performance. So yeah, integration should create scale. It should not create sameness. The goal is to make the goal isn't to make the acquired company look like you. The goal is to create a stronger company that either organization could not have been on its own.
It's so funny, like what you said earlier. I find it so reflective on just all transformations, and I think no matter what type of transformation you're doing, whether it's an acquisition, whether it's a digital or a technology or AI, and whatever those things are, I think we so often get into the mechanics and rush to the what and the how versus the why and the who. And I love what you said about stepping back and saying, why are we doing this in the first place? What is the intended outcome before we get into how are we going to do this and what are we going to do? And then obviously the who are the protecting those people that are likely going to be the assets to what is going to build the why. Thank you so much, Roxana. And I know, Wendy, we have another question.
Yeah, this is for Christina. I'm wondering if there's a company listening today that's about to do a major acquisition. What is the single earliest action they can take to create or protect long-term deal value?
Well, I think one of the things that they need to start doing earlier in the process is the change management campaign. Because when you start doing that, there are 10 key components to a fully orchestrated change campaign. And once you have worked through each one of those 10 components, you have essentially created your blueprint for how you're going to bring those teams together. And you've done it in a way where you're connecting the actions of every single employee to that strategy that you actually want to accomplish. By doing that, you're helping evolve that culture into what you want, what it is that the deal was based on, as well as helping it to evolve into a culture that embraces the accelerated pace of change that we need to succeed in today's environment. It is not an easy process, but the results will pay off.
Great. So moving on to the next question. Danny, so kind of based on what RGP sees across many deals, what are the 2 or 3 structural changes organizations need to make in how they run M&A to deliver more sustained value?
Sure, Jen, thanks. In terms of a few structural changes related in particular to this, topic, I would say 3 things. So one is, and we've alluded to this in a lot of our commentary so far, is this idea that paying more attention to human capital and culture in the diligence phase is critical. So moving away from a world of financial sort of quality of earnings, analytic focused diligence into a more integrated picture that really helps you assess talent and attention risks and pulse, getting a pulse for the organization and the people and those aspects of the deal is important. This idea that you could create a pretty robust sort of what I would call integration readiness or even separation readiness. We haven't touched much on separation, but picture in diligence as opposed to sort of focusing on the spreadsheet and then figuring the rest out post sign. The second structural change I would say is a more formal accountability between the CFO and the CHRO. So to Gerald's point, I fully believe culture is a cross-functional enabler. So it shouldn't be buried in the HR work stream. The HR work stream may sponsor it, but it's cross-functional. But this idea that the CFO and CHRO are aligned from the get-go, from the diligence phase, is in and of itself symbolic of the idea that people and talent and culture are important in the integration, as opposed to just the numbers and the value story. And the third thing I would say is thinking about extending the measurement horizon. So several of us have talked earlier in the call at this point around the idea that there's this 12, 24, 36-month horizon focused on ROI and value and dollars, but really looking beyond that into organizational integration, right? And really measuring, retention, the pulse of the employees through surveys, the degree to which there's cross collaboration, the degree to which joint decision making is occurring, and all these other sorts of things that extend beyond that sort of first kind of 12 to 24 months in a deal.
And I have a question. I'm going to throw one out to you guys, like rapid fire. So if we could put 3 non-financial metrics on every board dashboard post acquisition, what would they be? John, I'm going to throw it to you first.
Yeah, let's go with engagement scores.
Engagement scores.
Having a baseline and then updating that regularly.
Okay, good. Gerald?
Some specifics around talent, process, and capabilities, transfer and/or merger.
Okay. Roxana?
I would double down on that, obviously from the CHRO space, a talent process. Yeah.
Awesome.
Let's not operate in a war room. Let's figure out who people are.
Exactly. Christina? Oh, you're on mute, Christina.
I would agree with everything that was said there. I think one of the other things is internal mobility. So how many positions are filled by people who are going from one of the legacy companies to another position in one of the legacy company, the new company?
Yeah, that's a good one. And then Danny?
I love going last on questions like this. A lot of great things have already been said, and I would probably put them ahead of this one. But to add one, I'm going to go back to this sort of cross-legacy collaboration. So the extent to which you're seeing teams engage and jointly define and contribute and make decisions together, from sign onward, and how much that says about the degree to which cultures are coming together or not.
Okay, those are great answers. Before we go into our kind of closing questions, and then we have some great questions in the chat too. So a lot of good content still to hear. Let's do our last survey. So if you don't mind throwing that up there, Jackie and Nicole. All right, according to today's discussion, which of the following non-financial factors is most critical to sustaining long-term deal value after acquisition? Brand redesign initiatives, leadership continuity, cultural alignment, and talent retention, expanded debt capacity, and procurement consolidation. Okay, we'll just leave that for another few seconds, and then we'll kind of move into a couple more closing questions. All right, I think we can close that poll. All right, well, we are moving kind of in the home stretch, and I'd like to end by having us look forward. What needs to change, what risks may be accelerating, and what future of successful integration, what is the future of successful integration? What could that look like? And so my first question, this is going to go to the full panel, and, we would be remiss to not have one AI related question, but if AI makes diligence faster and cheaper, are we at risk of accelerating exactly the behaviors that are already destroying human value in deals? Or can AI help bridge the gap? And so I am going to kick this over. I'm going to start with Danny. I'm going to start with you this time.
Sure. I think that the thing with AI to me is we can't fear AI, right? So we have to look at AI as an enabler. So I think there's this notion that AI is there to rapidly accelerate and also replace a lot of the human aspects of in some contexts, everything. And I think that's entirely false, right? So if we think about M&A, AI in particular, the use of AI and M&A has kind of more than doubled according to various research sources over the last couple of years, right? And you see AI use throughout the life cycle from strategy and sourcing to sentiment analysis type things to accelerating diligence to accelerating planning to value creation, et cetera. I think the idea that we need to leverage AI to be better contributors in the M&A process as opposed to factoring out the human aspects, right? So you can leverage AI in terms of sentiments all throughout the process. You can leverage AI in terms of the analytics around engagement and things like that. But the idea that the human in the loop aspects, particularly around culture and talent, aren't going to remain incredibly strong is a bit flawed. So to me, it's about balancing how you use AI and really maintaining a tie back to sort of the human aspect and the human connection pieces of M&A. It can accelerate the process and it can make it more efficient, but you can't lose track of the human touch.
Great. Gerald, do you want to go next?
Sure. I would just echo Daniel, man plus machine, woman plus machine, not just machine. Any,
Mhm.
particularly in integration and particularly in the diligence and planning phase, anything that gets in the way of humans interacting um, is not going to do you well. Every single one of those integration teams is its own little mini culture lab. And as people grind through the differences in workflows and work processes or grind through synergies, we're going to learn things about each other's culture and how they respond and whatnot. And you don't want to lose that. AI can make it better. It'll grind through a lot of the data and the analytics so you can actually spend time on the understanding. Um, but AI, Zoom, whatever it is, don't lose that in-person human to human contact.
For sure. Christina?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Gerald and Daniel just said. I think, another thing to keep in mind that is companies in every industry are really working through how they're going to adopt AI. In doing that, they're touching a lot of the same processes that you would have in an M&A integration, people, data, processes, reimagining the business. So while AI definitely can help make things easier and get through the analysis quicker, there's actually an opportunity there. AI can be used as a catalyst to help bring the two legacy teams together in a common challenge of how they're going to utilize AI in their new combined business to produce the best ROI. And to Gerald's point, that the important thing to not lose sight of is that humans plus AI are always going to give you a better outcome than just one or the other.
Sure. Roxana, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with everything. I think my mantra is do use AI to surface insights. Do not use AI to make people decisions, right? It's that simple.
I love it. John, how about you?
I think there's a place for AI in diligence, but for the topics that we're talking about today, I'm probably on an island in terms of the value that it can be added here. So I'd probably lean away from that and focus more on the human engagement side of what makes things tick and integrate M&A deal.
Well,
Awesome.
that brings us to like a last closing question, I think, which is if you could redesign the modern M&A practice or process, who would be involved earlier? What metrics would matter the most? And how would accountability change from signing to year 5? I think, Gerald, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think we've talked about some of the metrics. I think, the accountabilities we've talked about. Probably the one thing that I would do very different is I would actually put, and this is not just for culture in general, I put a lot more emphasis on the upfront visioning. So we talk a lot about synergies and where we want to be, but I think the more you can paint a total picture of where I'm going, what it feels like, and so forth. And by the way, it won't be right. It will change in diligence, it'll change in planning, it'll change. But the more you can paint that, you will, number one, smoke out some of those disconnects earlier as people go, huh, that's not what I thought you were going to do. It'll help clarify your own thinking about what it is you're looking for, to the comments made earlier about which way am I going with the integration, one way, the other way, merge, keep. And finally, it will has the opportunity to inspire and get people to get above their differences in culture and say, hey, I see where we're going. I want to be part of that.
Interesting. I'm wondering, Danny, if what you think. Is there anything
Yeah.
else you'd
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly agree with Gerald's point, kind of going all the way back to the vision, even before the strategy of it, right, is critical. I think we've talked a lot today about metrics. We've talked a lot today about advancing the human capital aspect earlier in the life cycle of the process. I think the only thing I would add, and if I really think about where the majority of my clients still aren't at least partially the way there is not so much, diligence or sign to close. It's really that extending the timeline piece. So, it's still part of way too many deals that kind of 12, so in some cases at close, but in the best cases, 12 to 24 months later are like, we're done, right? We're good to go. Let's move on to the next thing. And I think really having a mindset of that 5 to 7 year horizon on any given deal is important. The other thing I might add is Jen talked a bit about transformation earlier. There are times when I see clients going through transactions and transformations at the same time, and the sentiment oftentimes is, well, first we will integrate while the existing business is transforming, and later we will figure out how to fold the acquired entity into the transformation. And I think that's flawed, right? That there's a bit of a not wanting to overwhelm with change, but I think if you're not bringing the acquired company along with that transformation journey, at least from an awareness perspective, then all you're really doing is hitting all those people twice, right? First, you're coming in and you have to be integrated, and our cultures have to marry, and then, oh, by the way, then you can come up to speed on this transformation. And I really think that's this idea of being able to integrate, no pun intended, M&A work into the transformation effort is important. Otherwise, like I said, you will potentially create a combined culture, but then you've got a split in how they're thinking about the future, because we weren't right alongside that. And that goes kind of to Jen's point, not just around sort of digital and technology transformations, but marketing and branding transformations, any sort of transformation agenda can really kind of wreak havoc on the value of a deal if they're not kind of brought alongside concurrently.
It's interesting. And I'm wondering, Roxana, if there's anything, you would add to this that
Everything that was being said. And I think the way we should look at M&A is really through the lens of leading with value, right? With finance, HR, tech, and the business working as equal partners, from diligence through integration. It no longer should be sort of siloed, because we see all the ways in which it fails when it is.
hmm And I'm wondering, John, if you have any last thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if I could change one thing about M&A processes, it'd be something that I've used. When a leadership team goes to manufacturing plant to visit the manufacturing plant, often use like listening sessions where the leadership team basically has to sit there and listen to what the frontline workers have to say about what's working and what's not working, and the plant, the conditions, things like that. I think that sort of tool, during the due diligence phase, if it's not confidential, if it's public, for a leadership team to sit there with the acquired target, or post closing for the acquiree to sit there and just listen to what are the concerns, and to be able to really, not just guess what people are thinking, but hear it straight from them in terms of what are they concerned about. I think that should be a requirement. Some companies do it, but I think it should be, part of the process.
Okay. And Christina, do you have anything that you'd want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely agree with it, Gerald and Daniel and John, Roxanne, all of them, all of y'all were saying. I think the thing that I would do differently is early in the process, I would team up the chief marketing officer and the chief human resources officer to get together to really help figure out that vision, that whole change management plan, not just the communications, but really working through those 10 key elements that I mentioned earlier. Doing that, it's going to help them really dig through and work out some of those challenges. Everything from listening to the frontline employees as you're co-creating, to really being able to tell that vision and help people understand, not just up front, but as they're moving through the journey, kind of, you are here. It helps them with making some of the ambiguity and some of the uncertainty feel just a little bit more certain.
Well, thank you guys. I know we're very close to time. I did want to reflect on, we didn't get to a lot of questions in the chat, but I did want to reflect on one. And it was, we discussed signs and remedies in detail, but is there also a framework of sorts that a company could use to see what kind of match it has with the acquirer or vice versa? And actually, we have, as part of our research study, created kind of a new deal playbook and some risk assessment stuff. And so for the person that wrote that in the chat, we'll definitely reach out and maybe set up a call. But if anybody else is interested in that stuff, Danny and I are happy to follow up. This is work that we do. It's really a combination of our human-centered design practice mixed with our M&A practice. We've done it for large acquirers that are focused on really creating kind of new blueprints for M&A, focused on the human value gap. So if you're interested in that, just drop a follow-up, just the words follow up in the chat, and we're happy to follow up with those materials. So again, as we wrap up this discussion, I think one theme that has really come through clearly, organizations are becoming increasingly sophisticated in how they value businesses financially, but they're still really underestimating the systems that actually sustain value over time: people, leadership, culture, trust, and organizational alignment. And I think what we heard today is that successful integration is not just about combining operations, it's really about protecting that human capability that made the acquisition valuable in the first place. So on behalf of RGP, I want to thank my incredible set of panelists, my co-moderator, our life and learning team who helps us work these lovely webinars. And I just want to thank all of you for being here. It's been a wonderful time, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.